listening to the best of the Martha Zoller Show. To hear the full show each day, tune in to AM 550 and FM 102.9 WDUN or log in to accesswdun.com and click the Listen Live button from 9 to 11 Monday through Friday. Joining us on the phone is Shabbos Kostenbaum. He's a Harvard student. He spoke at the Republican National Convention. I think it's fair to say he's a progressive. He's probably more liberal than most of the people that were in the room, but he has taken on the Harvard establishment related to anti-Semitism, and I wanted him to share his story here. Shabbos, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it and looking forward to our discussion. I think the intro as probably being the most progressive person at the RNC is pretty accurate, and I'm very for the RNC regardless for the opportunity.
So did you get to meet Donald Trump?
So I was meant to have, from what I understand, they were meant to have a quick meeting together, but after the assassination attempt, all of those plans were scrapped pretty quickly. So unfortunately not, but I was sitting 2 rows behind him in his box, so that was pretty cool.
That's pretty cool. So give people just a thumbnail explanation of what happened to you at Harvard and what the current status is.
Sure. So I'm a first-generation American. I'm also a proud Orthodox observant Jew. I came to Harvard University to study religion. I had been in an all-male religious seminary, yeshiva, my entire life, learning Jewish texts, Jewish law, Jewish philosophy from ultra-Orthodox rabbis. I actually lived in the old city of Jerusalem for a couple of years, so literally 2 minutes away from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Golden Mosque, and the Western Wall. And I came to Harvard because I wanted to learn from other people and diverse backgrounds, but also contribute my perspective to that conversation. And what I found quite quickly, unfortunately, is Harvard University, to sound like a liberal elitist, which really does train the next generation of American leaders, were not so receptive to hearing worldviews and ideologies that challenged their perspectives. And in particular, after the Hamas invasion of Israel on the night of October 7th, the amount of students and professors who, not even after Israel's invasion, but during the slaughter, during the night of October 7th, were drafting statements blaming Jews for the massacre. We're talking about how resistance is justified. We're talking about how Hamas is not a terrorist organization, but rather freedom fighters. That really cemented this sick feeling I've been building for a couple of months, that many of my classmates and professors did not hold liberal democratic values as one would expect them to hold. And, you know, I as much as I was joking about it, I do think it's important to make that point that I'm a progressive. I've only voted for Democrats. I even marched, don't hold it against me, I marched with Black Lives Matter. I marched when Roe v. Wade was overturned. But as a liberal, I can tell you unequivocally and unabashedly that my liberal allies have so abandoned and betrayed not just the Jewish people, but the American people. So when I planted 1,200 Israeli and American flags on Harvard's property, they were vandalized 3 times within 24 hours. These students are not just anti-Jewish and anti-Israel. They're deeply anti-American. They're anti-West. They're anti-capitalist. And it's about time that someone stands up and speaks out. And that's why I'm so honored, grateful, and privileged that the RNC allowed me to do that.
So are you taking any action against Harvard, and are you staying at Harvard?
Sure. So we are taking action. Not only do I get to criticize them at the RNC and on national media, but we filed a lawsuit. So we filed a lawsuit in late January. And what's really interesting is the crux of our lawsuit is actually an action that the Trump administration took. The Trump administration recategorized the definition of Judaism under law. So Title VI of the Civil Rights Act is a provision that prohibits recipients of federal dollars from discriminating based on race, color, and national origin. And what the Trump administration did was said, well, Judaism is not simply a religion, it's an ethnicity, which is true. Jews come from all backgrounds and countries and races and classes. And what binds us together is not simply our religion, but also our national origin. And because of that, we can now credibly go to a court of law and say, well, wait a minute. We are a protected minority class under Title VI, and Harvard is so clearly in violation of their federal obligations under law against discriminating against us. So we filed the lawsuit end of January. Harvard has been fighting tooth and nail to get the case dismissed, not only dismissed, but dismissed with prejudice, meaning that no other Jewish student would be able to bring these claims against them in a court of law. And we are obviously fighting back. We were actually just in court last week, and the judge is beginning his deliberations as to whether this will move to trial or whether this will be dismissed with prejudice. So even though I'm no longer a student at Harvard, I just graduated a month ago, we will be going down to Boston pretty often now for the court case, and we'll be helping the Jewish community and really the community at Harvard that is not anti-West, that is not anti-capitalist, that is not anti-American, stand up and fight back, because the fall semester will be very, very difficult.
You know, my daughter has gone through kind of a similar metamorphosis, that she's always voted Democrat. She's more liberal than I am. I mean, I'm a conservative talk show host. I'm out there with my opinions all the time. And, you know, this issue of Israel and anti-Semitism has really it made her think a lot, and it made her come understand that her friends that were liberal didn't want to hear her point of view, and that her understanding of what liberal meant was that you listen to all points of view. You're open. Liberal supposed to mean open-minded. And so and I don't want to blanket all liberals, but I'm just saying, you know, Harvard is supposed to be a revered university where ideas are taught and ideas are heard. And what we saw after October 7th from the Ivy League universities, which are supposed to be the best of the best, was shocking to me. I knew anti-Semitism still existed. As a Christian woman, I knew that, but I never knew at the level that it was. It shocked me.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's, you know, I can say this because I know these people. It's liberal hypocrisy. And I remember, I would never do this again, but I do remember marching with Black Lives Matter and responding to people when they said, well, all lives matter. And the response was, yeah, it's true, all lives matter. But right now we're talking about Black lives because they're being victimized, they're being oppressed by a racial system. However, when it comes to Jew hatred, when it comes to anti-Semitism, all of a sudden those same liberals, the same universities that were so insistent not to say all lives matter, they won't even say the word anti-Semitism. In fact, there's no word at Harvard called anti-Semitism. What it's called is anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. They have to equate. They have to say that we stand against Jew hatred, but all forms of hatred and bigotry. But they've never once taken that logic and applied that to other minority groups. With other minority groups, there is clarity. So, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, for whatever reason, Harvard decided to make a statement, because that's what they do. They make statements about things that do not affect their students. And they said, this is fascism, this is illegal, this is a clear case of right and wrong. But when it came to combating anti-Semitism, they could not have that clarity. They had to equate. They had to talk about we're against all forms of hatred. And in fact, when George Floyd was killed, within a couple of days, they had a strongly worded statement saying that they were going to rid themselves as an institution of racism and white supremacy. Well, after the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, it took them days to write something, and when they did, they couldn't even condemn Hamas. I mean, what a morally bankrupt institution. And the Jewish vote typically goes about 70% to the Democrats. But we are going to see record numbers of Jewish people who are turning away from the Democratic Party. And it's not because we abandoned the Democrats, it's because the Democrats abandoned us.
So do you see your vote changing for this election, or are you still considering?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you a very boring diplomatic answer.
Okay.
I said this at the RNC. I am very proud to support President Trump's policies to expel foreign students who violate American law. That should not be partisan. It should not be controversial. In fact, it is literally already the law. But the Republicans are the only ones talking about these things. I'm in favor of bringing back patriotism and Western values into our school system. I am in favor of supporting the state of Israel and giving them the ammunition they need whenever they need it. Again, these should not be controversial issues. They should not be partisan, but they are. And if the Democrats want me to speak at the Democratic convention, or if they want any Jewish student to speak, we would be honored to do so. But the reality is they're not so interested. And you are not going to have Israeli flags at the Democratic Convention unless, of course, they're being burnt by protesters outside. You are not going to have chance of bring them home, referring to the American Jewish hostages being held in Gaza. You will not have those chants at the DNC. We had them, of course, at the RNC. And it is a damning indictment on the state of my party that they have abandoned Jewish people in such clear, obvious ways. So, it's an answer. My answer sort of evades the question.
I understand. And look, you should keep your vote private if you want to. I mean, that's perfectly fine. What are you doing now, Shabbos?
Sure. So now I'm really speaking across the country, going to as many people as possible to bring about these issues and bring about change. I just spoke at the Christians United for Israel conference run by Pastor John Hagee. And the amount of people who came up and hugged me and said they're praying for me and they're praying for the Jewish state and the hostages was incredible. So whatever I can do to implement change, whether it's socially or politically, I go to Capitol Hill quite often now. That's what's been occupying my time. And in terms of what I will be doing professionally, I'd love to pursue a career in public policy, maybe even elected office. But ultimately, the goal is to create change for the community, the Jewish community that I was brought up in and that I know and love. And I will keep speaking out. And as I said, I'm so honored and privileged that I've been given a platform to do so. And I'm not going to stop.
Well, Shabbos Kastenbaum, good luck to everything you do. If you come down and do any speeches in Atlanta, we're going to get together in person. So please
I would love that.
Let me know. I would love to do that because, I had a Jewish friend of mine say to me, I voted Democrat all my life, but conservative Christians have been the best friends the Jews have had in the last 50 years. So I understand the confusion. You know what I mean? I understand the confusion. But we don't like the way they talk about other issues. That's what she said to me. So anyway, we got to find this common ground. That's how we're going to get back together. And I will be happy to help you in restoring Western values and talking about things and open ideas. And being liberal is not a bad thing. What they're being is illiberal. And, we've got to see what's happening there. Shabbos, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you. God bless.
It's where North Georgia comes to talk. It's the Martha Zoller Show on AM 550 and FM 102.9 WDUN.
So joining me right now is Michael O'Neill, who is the Vice President of Legal Affairs at Landmark Legal. And I just want to understand, we've known since FDR that Democrats have wanted to pack the court. And the one thing we know about Democrats is they never give up. I mean, whether it was Woodrow Wilson talking about health care, they didn't give up. I mean, they worked on it for 100 years. Now we're coming up on 100 years of talking about court packing, and they're still talking about it. So, Michael, welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm well. Well, yeah, exactly. And they were talking about it back in the 1930s because what you're talking about is because the Supreme Court at the time was consistently striking down the New Deal legislation that FDR was trying to get through and had implemented. And he made this famous proclamation that they were going to introduce legislation expanding the court from 9 justices to 15 justices. So FDR would be able to appoint 6 new justices and have control of it. And his pressure and the exertion of the pressure worked. One of the moderate justices, Justice Owen Roberts, back in the 1930s, not to be confused with Chief Justice John Roberts, but Justice Owen Roberts, the swing vote of the court at the time, switched his jurisprudential philosophy, and it was called the switch in time that saved 9, and started upholding it. So they had a five vote majority of the 9 justices of the Supreme Court, and then the rest is history. Well, again, the subsequent decades was kind of quieted down because, for all intents and purposes, the left really kind of controlled the United States, had a majority. If you think of the Warren Court and through the 60s and 70s, all of those decisions, you think of Roe versus Wade, and well, lo and behold, in the 2020s, now you have a so-called conservative majority on the court, and again, specter of 1930s raises its head. And you have the decisions from the court in its current configuration are just intolerable to the left. And so you now have this institutional pressure where you're seeing the introduction of term limits, and you're seeing this imposition of a binding code of conduct. This is to exert pressure on the sitting justices to change their jurisprudential philosophy.
And it's so interesting you mentioned the Warren Court because Warren had such an interesting background because he had been a governor of California before he ended up being on the Supreme Court, which is kind of an unusual path as we look at it today.
Right.
You know what I mean? The path to the Supreme Court was very different up until World War II than after World War II, because there wasn't this idea that there was this path like we look at now, that you have to be in other things. You did have people that just came out of random backgrounds that weren't necessarily judicial backgrounds, and then they'd end up on the Supreme Court. So it was very interesting. And look, I'm kind of a corny, old school girl where I don't like every decision the Supreme Court makes, but I'm not supposed to like it. What I'm supposed to understand is, was it constitutional, which means sometimes I'm going to like it and sometimes I'm not going to like it. But it doesn't mean you remake the court. Eventually the court's going to change because you have appointments to the court, and what they're trying to do with this proposal is somehow control the appointments to the court.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny, you're talking about decisions that you don't necessarily agree with. And what springs to mind is one that just came out this term. It's called the FDA versus Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine. This was an anti-abortion group, a pro-life group, made challenges, a group of doctors made a challenge to the FDA's regulation that loosened the regulations on the over-the-counter abortion meds and essentially allowed it the easily accessibility and of these over-the-counter abortion medicine or abortion pills, and a group of doctors had challenged it. Well, the Supreme Court didn't actually address the merits of that. They addressed a threshold issue, which is standing. And they threw out the case. They said that these doctors that were challenging the FDA regulatory work did not have standing. So, I pull this out when people say, oh, the Supreme Court is ideological, the Supreme Court is political. Well, if the Supreme Court is political, don't you think they would have taken the opportunity, and these justices are such right-wing radicals, don't you think they would have taken the opportunity to concoct some sort of standing and to address the merits of this? They did not. They followed the rule of law, and they realized, the majority of the court said, well, these doctors didn't pass that threshold issue of standing, therefore we can't adjudicate their claims. So this is just, Martha, it's nonsense when you talk about that this is some sort of political Supreme Court, that this is some ideologically driven Supreme Court. What the Supreme Court is upholding the rule of law, upholding the separation of powers, respecting the inherent constitutional structure that the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branches all stay in their lanes, and that they have defined roles, and that they should not overstep their bounds. And I think that's really what's been found to be intolerable from the left.
So do you think, obviously anything to this level would have to be a constitutional amendment, correct?
Well, not necessarily. Well, in term limits and a binding code of conduct, you can actually impose those via I think term limits, I think it might have to be a constitutional amendment. I know if you want to expand the number of justices, you can do that via legislation, but that isn't on the table right now because there's nothing in the Constitution that says you have to have 9 justices on the Supreme Court. So I think term limits might have to be a constitutional amendment, and certainly the first point of Biden's proposal, which is overturning the U.S. v. Trump. This is the presidential immunity case. That definitely has to be a constitutional amendment. Binding code of conduct, I think that could be via legislation.
So, what are the points of this plan?
Yeah, that's what I was talking about. The first point is again, they found the U.S. versus Trump intolerable, which is odd because the left now is somehow saying that presidential immunity for criminal conviction for presidents post-presidency doesn't exist, which I'm not clear about that, because even during oral arguments, both sides conceded that the president of the United States enjoys some immunity from criminal prosecution when he's functioning within his core Article 2 powers. And think about that. I think about 9/11 and that day when President Bush had to give the order to shoot down the domestic airlines because they could have crashed into the Capitol. And he gave that order. What if he had to be? He was functioning within his core Article 2 powers. He has to have immunity from criminal culpability in those instances because he has to be able to function as president. So I really don't understand why they would want to have a constitutional amendment saying that the president has no immunity from criminal prosecution. That one is just bizarre to me. The second one is, again, term limits for SCOTUS. They want to have justices serve 18 years and have every 2 years have a president appoint a new justice, which, again, I don't know how that would be implemented, because what would you do? Are they planning on forcing out Justice Thomas and Chief Justice Roberts because they've served in excess of 18 years so that the new president has 2 immediate appointments right when they take office? I don't know how that's going to be applicable. And then, again, the third one is this institute a binding code of conduct. and the question I asked there on the Supreme Court justices, the question I asked there is, well, who would enforce that? Would you have Congress enforce that, a committee in Congress? Invariably, that would be politicized.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you want to talk about term limits about everything? I might consider that. But the Constitution's pretty clear that these were lifetime appointments, and the reason so that they could be independent. So I think you'd have to have a constitutional amendment to do that. Then this code of conduct, look, they all fly. If you want to do that, great. In fact, yesterday or the day before, they had this hearing, a committee hearing on stock purchases and trying to keep Congress from doing stock purchases. I personally think that didn't go that far. I don't think they should be able to have meals. I don't think they should be able to fly on private jets. I don't think they should get sports tickets. I don't think they should get any of that stuff. I think all those perks of the office should go away because this should not be a job that you want to aspire to and retire from. Okay, this should be a job that's about public service. I mean, in Georgia, you can't even buy a cup of coffee for a state legislator. Okay, because they don't want anything to look that way. Now, granted, people find ways around it. They bring food in for everybody, or they bring coffee in for everybody, and then you get around the rule that way. But bottom line is this is all ridiculous, and it's not going anywhere. And I don't understand. When you look at any list of issues, the Supreme Court is like the 50th list. If it even shows up, it's like 50th on the list. Why are they pursuing this?
Right, they're pursuing it for a couple of reasons. First of all, there is a radical segment of the left base that takes incredible interest and gets incredibly energized by the Supreme Court, and they're just increasing anger. Again, I think one of the hidden things here is the Supreme Court has really made an effort the past few years to return the legislative power to the Congress and say to administrative agencies like the EPA, hey, you don't just have this unfettered ability to enact laws via the administrative process. So I think that really sticks in the craw with a lot of the left. And obviously you have the Dobbs decision, which I think motivates a lot of the radical left. And so they've just been incensed by the Supreme Court. So this is to pander to that base to say, hey, look, we're doing something, quote unquote. And then the second purpose, I think, of this is to continue on this unceasing pressure campaign on the justices of the Supreme Court. Again, you have arguably 6 justices that have a quote unquote conservative outlook, or I wouldn't say that, but that's what the common parlance is. So the left wants to have this unceasing pressure campaign. Again, they think, hey, it worked in the 1930s. We want to see if it can work today, if we can move some of these middling justices to our side and start to do this. So again, you see Chuck Schumer on Meet the Press, again, return to his incendiary rhetoric. You see these sorts of institutional pressures. You see this informal pressure that the justices invariably have when they come to Washington, D.C. and start participating in the social scenes of Washington, D.C. So I think there's always this pressure, this unending, unyielding pressure on the justices to move to the left. And this is just the latest in that continuum for them. So
what do we need to do? Is there anything we need to do, or just wait for this to fizzle out?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you need to just keep an eye on it, because this isn't going to go away. They're going to, as long as the Supreme Court continues to issue opinions, and again, their opinions are not necessarily hand in glove with the conservative movement. I talked about that FDA case from earlier. So, but as long as the court doesn't move in lockstep with the modern left's agenda, there's going to be this continual pressure on them. And at some point, the left banks on this. If we've laid the groundwork, if we lay the foundation, 5-10 years from now, we might be able to institute some of these challenges.
I mean,
so
honestly, every study shows that over time, Supreme Court justices kind of drift to the left. I mean, they don't become hard lefties, necessarily, but over time, every study, I mean, I went back to school a few years ago in American politics, and we did a number of classes on this, is that over time, they do drift to the left a little more. But I would argue it's not drifting to the left. It's that they are completely independent in what they do. Regardless of whether people believe that or not, just look at the totality of their work. They're consistent in what they do. You take a Sam Alito. People call him a conservative. Yeah, he is. But he's consistent when you read his decisions. When you read the decisions of John Roberts, who has been controversial in the conservative community, read his decisions. He's consistent in his thought process. You may not like what he decides, but he's consistent.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, John Roberts' judicial minimalism. he calls balls and strikes and doesn't. And if there's an exit ramp to deciding a major issue, he will take the exit ramp. Again, I told you before that FDA case where they said, look, we're going to throw it out on the basis of standing. That just for me, that demonstrates that they are more interested in upholding the rule of law than imposing any particular ideology from a conservative or liberal standpoint. They say, look, we have to go through a process. We have to understand the rule of law and respect the rule of law. And when certain foundational principles are not play, we can't reach the merits of these larger issues. And I think that's characteristic of this current judiciary, of the makeup of the U.S. Supreme Court.
If people want to know about Landmark Legal Foundation, how can they find out?
Yeah, thanks, Martha. You can go to landmarklegal.org. That's our website where we have all the activities we're up to, and you can just check us out on X, Landmark Legal Foundation.
Putting the talk in news talk. It's the Martha Zoller Show on AM 550 and FM 102.9 WDUN.
I'm just so happy to welcome my next guest here to the book. Actually, it's called Women in Politics: Breaking Down Barriers to True Representation. And Mary Hayashi. Is that right, Mary? Did I say it right?
That's correct,
Okay.
Martha. Thank you.
Yes, and she was a California State Assembly member. She takes a look at 17 women in political leadership. And when I was 56, Mary, I went back to school to get a master's degree. I had always wanted to do it, and I got married, had children, raised children, all that stuff. And so finally, when I was 56, I had time to do it. And I got my master's in American politics, and my thesis was on women's electoral success. And so I was so excited to get your book and read it because it's a topic that I'm very interested in. And I don't want to vote for women just because they're women. Okay, I'm more of an ideological voter. But I also believe that with women being 55% of the overall electorate, we need to be doing a better job of uplifting and electing women.
Yes, thank you, Martha, and thank you for that introduction too, because one of the women interviewed in the book is Celinda Lake, and she's a very accomplished pollster, currently working for the Harris campaign now. She was working for Biden campaign, but she actually wrote a book with Kellyanne Conway, which I referenced in my book, and women vote mostly along the party lines. We don't always vote for the women candidate on the ballot. Same for me as well. So I think that is a very common practice. But like as you stated, I think you just summarized the book. We do need to look at gender parity, and we need to support more women in politics, and so that's exactly what the book is about.
And
so
you and I are politically different, and that's okay because I love talking to everybody. But what is interesting is when I pitched the idea to do my thesis, the professor, his name is Charles Bullock. I don't know if you've ever come across any of his work, but he was like the first person to write academically about women's electoral success. But back when he started writing about women's electoral success, he's in his 80s now, it was women got into power because their husbands died, and then they got appointed to whatever the position was. This paper came out in the 1970s, and early 1970s. And so throughout his career, and he is a tenured professor at the University of Georgia, throughout his career, he has been writing about all of these changes. So I'm sitting here, he's one of my professors on my committee, and I'm talking about the idea that I have. And he looked at me and he said, Martha, what you need to do is work on your own party because, the Republicans have a lot of ground to gain related to electing women compared to Democrats. And it was a hard lesson to learn, and I spent 5 years working on that thesis because I was working full-time as well as going to school, and it was just the best experience of my life. It was so great being in these classes with these 25-year-olds because they assumed because I was a Republican that I was a certain thing, and by the end of the class, they looked at me as someone that could help them get a job. So it was really interesting.
Fabulous. Well, that's interesting because one of the people that I interviewed for my book is a man, and he's a mentor of mine. And almost everyone I talked to had a male mentor or somebody very prominent in their career in politics who's a man who helped them. So even though, the political science that you mentioned may be sort of covering different generations, a lot of the women in this book also benefited from like a father who was in the legislature, for instance, or a male mentor who was very prominent in their lives, who gave them their first job. And so men are definitely part of this equation. When you were speaking, I was thinking about Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who I also admire greatly, and who I actually mentioned a lot in my book, because here's a young woman, in Congress, and she started an organization promoting gender parity and recruiting more Republican women to run for Congress. I mean, in 2019, she recruited over 100 women and started this EPAC and started raising money. And then a Congressman, Tom Emmer, I think it was,
Yes.
who basically said, I think this is a mistake. And she responded to him by saying, I wasn't asking for your permission. And I just love that.
Yeah.
And so when you were talking, about her.
She is a great example, because she's got a young family. Katie Britt is another one who's a senator from Alabama who's got a young family. And usually that's a difficult time, for women to step out and be a part of things. And, Jennifer Lawless, who's done a lot of the research on this area, says that, we're harder on ourselves. Women candidates I ran for Congress in 2012. I lost in the runoff. We're harder on ourselves. We expect more from us. A guy will run for 14 different offices. He doesn't care how many times he loses. He just keeps on running. and women are different. And we've seen in the last 3 elections, Mary, that elections have been determined by suburban and exurban women. I like to call them squishy Republicans. You might call them squishy Democrats. I don't know. But they move around. Their vote is more fluid, okay? And depending on where they go is how the election goes. So we have a lot of power, but we're not as likely to vote for women. And it's interesting, I think.
Right. And I'm glad you referenced Jennifer Lawless' work, because I used her work extensively in my book. And one of the studies that I always like to talk about is it's called Men Rule, and it talks about how 60% men were 60% more likely than women to evaluate themselves very qualified to run for office when men and women had identical qualifications. And so you're right. Women tend to view ourselves less qualified than men. And so and then what's more is that when men evaluated themselves not qualified to run, a lot of them are still run anyway. They said, I'm going to run anyway. I don't care if I'm unqualified. And so that's a very fundamental difference between men and women, that when it comes to gender gap and political ambition, that men are more likely than women to, evaluate themselves more qualified. But it's not always just like our fault, because it's also the messaging that we get. We're not encouraged to run. Like, men are encouraged to be ambitious and seek a leadership position. But when women run, it's like, well, do you have kids? It's like, well, do you ask the same question to male candidates? Probably not. And so we do experience, I think, double standards, higher sort of threshold for qualification gap. And, for leadership positions like this, I think people look at women and say, well, are you ready to lead? Do you have the sort of a confidence and the qualification to lead? And so we always have to justify and explain ourselves much more than men. And so it's, even though we sort of put that on ourselves, it's really the institution and the societal cultural norms that sort of dictate our behavior as well.
So Mary Hayashi is the author of the book Women in Politics, and she was a California State Legislature Assembly member from 2006 until 2012. And, you're from California. I got to ask you, this is my final question, because, California has been through a lot, and for the first time in its history, it's lost population and I think it's roughly 1 million in the last census that came out. So what's your sense of women, not women in politics, but what's your sense of California and the state of play right now? Because from us here looking in, it looks like y'all got a lot of issues.
We have a lot of, challenges, and we've also made, to me, tremendous progress in terms of women in politics, because in California legislature, in the state Senate, for instance, we're going to get to 50% gender parity, first time in California history. And I know that a lot of people from sort of looking outside in, they think that we're very progressive and forward thinking. But when we look at gender parity, for instance, since women were allowed to vote and run for office, we've only had 192 women serve in the California legislature out of 4,400 people. So people think that we're really, progressive and forward thinking, and that's not always the case. And in terms of people leaving the state, I'm not an expert in that, but I do think that there's a lot of misconceptions about that as well, because the crime rates have gone down in certain, urban cities. And I do think that there is some misrepresentation happening about that. I want to go back to one of the things that you were asking, or you brought up earlier, about suburban women voting in this battleground states, given that this is an election year. I was just looking at one of the Republican pollsters posted they're circulating a memo, it's fresh, it's as of this morning. And, that's about 50% of the women are actually voting for women in those battleground states. And that's a real issue that we need to sort of explore. And most of the women are leaning Republican. They're not leaning Democrats. And I think, for going back to Californians again, when we think of independent voters, sometimes we make the mistake of thinking, independent voters like California. And that's not true. Independent voters in those battleground states are nothing like us. They lean more conservative, actually.
Yeah.
Whereas Bay Area, California, independent voters, they lean more Green Party, or they lean more progressive. And so I think sometimes our observations are skewed, and it's not always clear.
Well,
and we need to.
And I love the point you make, because I think that one of the things we miss is, and I talk about this all the time in front of Republican groups, that a Georgia Republican is not going to be the same as a Maine Republican or a California Republican. And we have to have a big tent even within our own party. And I think Democrats have that same problem, is that everybody thinks the progressive wing of the party is driving the party, and maybe it is, but I know there's a group of evangelical Democrats called the AND campaign here in Georgia, where they're very frustrated because they feel like the Democratic Party has sort of left them as religious people, but they still have Democratic values as far as the party goes. So you bring up a great point, because we've got to be more inclusive in understanding that even geographically, you're going to have different views on different things. But Mary Hassani, thank you so much for being with me today. The book is Women in Politics, and thank you very much. To hear the full versions of last week's Martha Zoller shows, go to the podcast page at accesswdun.com, and you can follow me on social media at Martha Zoller.